Welcome. It's a very interesting segment we're going to do. We're going to touch on some issues that are very important in our society, especially when we have a lot of students here today. We're going to talk about bullying and some aspects of mental health. We have Ed Paley here. Let's give it up for Ed. Ed has a little bit experience in social work, 40 years. Ed, why don't you talk about your background first and your experience about so many important issues that are prevalent in today's society?
Well, I think, I've been a clinical social worker now for 40 years. I spent 14 of those years in the South Bronx, and I've been working out on Long Island since 1985. And I worked at what I consider to be the best child and family agency on Long Island, and maybe one of the best in the country, North Shore Child and Family Guidance, where I worked from 1985 to 1996. And I implemented and coordinated a family bereavement program. And also, I co-facilitated the first group on Long Island for people that lost a loved one to suicide. And suicide continues to be, it's always been here as long as society has been around, and it continues to be here. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's goal is by the year 2025 is to reduce suicide in this country by 25%. And I think that's possible. It's a sense of educating everyone, and especially young people, but all people. The highest suicide rate now in the country is among white men 65 and over. And suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people from 10 to 25. And what we got to do is let everyone know that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem, and it takes courage to live, not to die, and that you don't have to deal with your sadness, your depression alone. That there, in Long Island, there are two excellent 24-hour hotlines. In Nassau counties, there's a Long Island Crisis Center. It's available 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 679-1111. And in Suffolk, it's called Response. And it's 631-731-7500. And what both lines are now doing is, because there are certain young people especially that prefer to communicate through the computer, through the internet. So they now have trained counselors that will respond as soon as you click that you want a conversation. Everything is confidential. All the volunteers undergo 250 hours of training under the supervision of a clinical social worker who's always available. The volunteers are never left alone. There is a professional, well-trained social worker. And these two, I know the directors and the staff at these two agencies, and what they're doing is very, very important.
And you know what? Suicide has touched us here in the Long Beach community. We've had done many shows dealing with suicide, and we got very friendly with the two families that have had terrible tragedies. We had Daniel, who was a Long Beach senior, took his life, and we had an 8th grader, took his life recently. It's been and the 8th grader was more of a directive bullying.
Yeah.
And that's so prevalent in our society where a young child, like in this case, went to a pizzeria, 3 kids followed him home from school. They beat him up, went upstairs and took his own life. And we hear stories like that, unfortunately, way too much.
Yes. Well, first, my sincere condolences. Out in Suffolk County this past last spring, there were 4 suicides among different school districts. In Nassau County, there's been a number of suicides. And I think that what I've said when I work with parents or loved ones who have lost a loved one to suicide, no one is in anyone else's head. And parents will frequently do the what ifs, could ifs, I should have known, I could have known. And in 90% of the time, there's usually some clues. People usually have they're going through a depression or a mental illness. They're either in treatment or not in treatment. They may have, in addition, an alcohol or drug problem. But I have a best friend. My wife and I met them 36 years ago on our honeymoon. At the time, they had been married 5 years, no children. They went on to have a daughter and 3 boys. And 12 years ago, their 18-year-old son, he was a freshman in Albany. His girlfriend in high school had broken up with him a second time. No history of mental illness, no history of drug or alcohol abuse. It was an impulsive act. He hung himself.
Oh, terrible.
And going to this funeral and the wake was very, very difficult. You know, your life is never the same. Every death is a tragedy. Your life is never the same after you lose someone. But when it comes to suicide, it has other complicated grief issues. I'll just, briefly say, 58 years ago, and I'm in the process of finishing a book about it. 58 years ago, my dad died of a heart attack. I grew up in the Bronx. I was 10 and a half years old. Well, 58 years ago, there were no bereavement books. There were no bereavement groups. There were no people like myself who specialize in grief work. And the consequences for my 3 siblings and myself and my mother were unbelievable. So my book that I'm finishing up, that hopefully will come out next June on my 70th birthday, will be it's called A Boy from the Bronx, a story of hope and triumph over tragedy. And I'm not writing it to make money. I'm writing it because, as I mentioned, the one universal in life is sooner or later we all got to deal with death of a loved one. We got to deal with transition. A great book that Judith Voice wrote a book a number of years ago that everyone should read. It's called Necessary Losses. And she speaks about from the moment we're born to the moment we die. We're dealing with loss when we graduate to the next grade. Well, we're giving up a year with that teacher. That's a loss. It's a different kind of loss than a death, but it's still a loss. When we lose a job, when this young man here, who is an inspiration,
Absolutely.
Michael, I want to thank you for, I'm glad that Howie asked me to come tonight. I had the chance to meet you because you are an inspiration, because you represent, in the sense, I tell people that when the show Survivor, I said, well, let me introduce you to some real survivors. And you are certainly a real survivor, sir. And I think it's how we deal with different things. And that young man that you just mentioned in 8th grade, what was done to him was terrible. And he probably was struggling with some issues. And so the way he dealt with it was to go upstairs and end his life. And hopefully
I don't want to cut you off.
No, go ahead, please.
But Rocco mentioned something before, and I think we really have to raise awareness on it because I think it needs to be talked about.
Please.
There was a story about a reporter that was just fired at Fox News named Eric Bolling. And it's not bad enough that he got fired from Fox News, but his son was so distraught about the situation, he ended up taking his own life in college. So my point is, when you know someone is going to be under duress, isn't that the time to give that person some extra attention? Because obviously they said he was very close to his dad.
Right.
Probably the fact his dad was losing his job might have been the tipping point in him taking his own life.
Yeah. I read about that this morning, and I think that we still have to hopefully find out more facts. And it's not clear if it was an overdose, if it was a suicide, but in either case, these parents suffered a terrible tragedy, the death of their son.
It just seems more than coincidence that it happened.
No, I think that's true, and I think that modern technology is great, but the way we're speaking now, okay, the show that you're doing, people, including people my age, younger, older, we don't connect with one another on a human level. My wife and I will go out on a Saturday night, and I see couples and families out. Why are they even out? No one is communicating. Everyone is texting, checking their email, checking their phone, and we need to connect on a human level. That's what I do as a clinical social work therapist. I connect with people on a human level.
That's what you have to do.
Let them know that I care. I sat for 11 and a half years when I was in North Shore Child with a young man who every single week he spoke to me about suicide. And I had to make a clinical decision every single week. Do I hospitalize him? What do I do? This young man is now in his 40s, and I hear from him from time to time, because when I left North Shore Child, his parents were willing to pay me whatever I wanted to continue to treat him. But I felt that this young man needed to be under the treatment of an agency where there was full-time staff and so on. But what I did with this young man, I connected with him on a human level. And when he said to me, Ed, if I kill myself, will you come to my funeral? And I said, I will come to your funeral and I will cry and feel sad. And I worked with him over the years using different therapeutic approaches to connect with him and to let him know that I cared about him and what happened to him and so on. So I think what you're saying is, like I said, suicide raises other complex issues when it comes to grief. But the important thing is there's help available. And that's what people need to know, that if they lose someone to suicide or any kind of death, that there are agencies and different places that are providing supportive groups and so on, that no one has to walk the path of grief or any kind of problem, whether you're bullied and so on, that you walk it alone. I teach kids and adults, because adults get Howie bullied also. I teach people, how do you deal with bullies? And how do you also believe in yourself?
Absolutely. Now, and I just want to mention this event, Walk to Fight Suicide. When is it going to be and where?
It's going to be Sunday, October 22nd at Jones Beach, Field 5. And if you have questions, you can call 516-869-4215. The walk begins at 10 o'clock. You can come and not raise any money, or you can get people to sponsor you. I have never had anyone refuse to sponsor me. And you can register today at afsp.org/Long Island Walk. And we used to do this walk at Old Westbury Gardens. And we wound up that we outgrew Old Westbury Gardens. Last year at the walk at Jones Beach, we had 6,000 people walking for suicide prevention. And we have face painting, we have clowns, we have music, we have food. And what happens is a lot of people that have lost a loved one to suicide will come together as a team. They have a picture of their loved one on their shirt, and people come together to show support. So I would ask you to get the word out, and for anyone to come down on that day. And people will be there registering people from 8 o'clock on Sunday, October 22nd. Thank you, Howie.
Okay.